In the mountains of eastern Kentucky, there are cemeteries that do not appear on most maps. They are perched above winding dirt roads where fog descends and doesn't lift until noon. The dead are not interred deeply in these locations. It's thin soil. Old trees' roots frequently reach the surface, giving the impression that the mountain is reluctant to give up what it has claimed. Just before dusk, in the early fall of 1893, a small procession was held at one such cemetery with a view of the town of Harlem. There was no carriage, only boots moving slowly through damp grass, and the silence was broken by the sound of breathing. At the center of that procession was a wooden coffin carried by 4 men who did not speak to one another. Less than a day after giving birth to her first child, 26-year-old Eliza Rowan was found dead inside. There was a lot of mist in the mountain air, the kind that dampens clothing and hair but never turns into rain. A minister's voice was thin against the hillside as he read from the Bible. A few neighbors were standing far away, wearing hats. Harlan's grief was rarely audible, as it was pressed to their chest, eyes downcast. It was measured, observed, and recalled. Caleb Rowan, Eliza's husband, was standing closest to the grave. He was a tall man with hands hardened from hunting and woodworking. His coat hung loose on his shoulders as if he had lost weight overnight. Those who later tried to recall his face struggled to describe it. Some said he looked empty. Others said calm. No one said broken. Just behind him stood Ruth Rowan, Eliza's twin sister. The 2 women's similarities were so complete that even those who had known them since childhood occasionally had trouble pronouncing their names. The same quiet eyes that never seemed to fully meet someone's gaze, the same narrow chin, and the same long dark hair tied low. Something strange happened as the coffin was lowered into the earth. Caleb Rowan did not glance down as the minister went on speaking, and the ropes creaked under his weight. His gaze moved to the side and settled on Ruth. Not quickly, not by accident. He observed her with the same unwavering focus that one might apply to something brittle that might fall away if not secured. Ruth felt it. She didn't turn. Her shoulders tensed as she continued to look at the ground in the unfinished hole carved into the mountainside. She later told no one about that moment. Such information was buried or kept secret in Harlem. After the burial, neighbors returned quietly to their homes. No one lingered. Over the coming days, food would be delivered to the Rowan cabin as no one would stay long enough to discuss what followed, despite tradition's demands. Death was accepted. After that, each family retreated behind its own door. Eliza was laid to rest before dusk. By nightfall, the mountain had swallowed the sound of her name. The Rowan cabin stood east of town, pressed against a line of dense trees. It was a single-story structure built from rough timber with a stone hearth that smoked when the wind shifted. Nothing had been moved inside. Eliza Shaw was still suspended from the door's nail. The boots were neatly arranged under the bed. On the windowsill where she used to spend her evenings, there was a tiny brush filled with her hair. Ruth remained there that night. Nobody asked her to go. The newborn slept in a wooden cradle beside the hearth. Ruth tended to the child while Caleb sat at the table, hands folded, staring at the grain of the wood as if reading something written there. They didn't say much. Words felt unnecessary or dangerous. It grew dark outside the mountain. During the times that. After that, Ruth reminded herself that she was only going to be there for a short time, a sister supporting a widower, a common arrangement in a place where women frequently passed away at a young age and families banded together around what was left. But even then there were small things that troubled her. Caleb did not ask questions about the child care. He didn't give directions. Rather, he observed. He stopped whatever he was doing when Ruth hummed softly. He gave a single nod as though to confirm something when she brought the cradle closer to the flames. He already knew. The tiny side room that had been used for storage was where Ruth slept at night. Eliza's bedroom was left unaltered. The door remained shut. When Ruth was awake, Caleb never went inside. Ruth went outside to fetch water from the barrel on the fourth night following the burial. As she turned back toward the cabin, she saw a light flickering in the bedroom window. She did not confront him in the supposedly empty room. She told herself it was nothing. Grief had many shapes. No matter how peculiar their rituals were, people were free to practice them in the mountains as long as they didn't disturb other people. However, Caleb's gait had already started to shift in some way. He stopped passing Ruth. He moved around her as if she were something that needed to remain exactly where it was. This story is not about a sudden act of violence. It has nothing to do with a crime that is neatly documented in court records or ledgers. It is about something slower, something that took shape. Silently, day by day, in a home where the deceased were never really gone. Please take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment if you find stories like these, which vanish into the shadows of forgotten history, to be fascinating. Only when someone chooses to pay attention are these locations and the individuals who disappeared within them remembered. Because Ruth Rowan's disappearance was not the start of what happened to her. It started at a mountain graveside where the ground was too thin to contain the truth. For long, Ruth Rowan did not mark the passing of days by a calendar. The way smoke rose from chimneys in the morning, the sound of axes resonating through the trees, or the length of time a pot of beans simmered before dusk were all used to gauge time in the mountains. After the burial, she remained in the Rowan cabin because leaving felt impossible. The baby required attention. Caleb did not ask her to stay, but he never suggested she should go. The lack of a request became an answer in and of itself. The house itself seemed to oppose change. Eliza's belongings remained exactly where they had been before her death. Ruth noticed this immediately. The dead were swiftly removed from many mountain homes. Beds were stripped and cleaned, and clothing was burned or given to family members. It was thought that lingering items attracted restless spirits. However, nothing was disturbed here. Eliza's boots were still positioned underneath the bed, with her toes facing outward as she had always liked, and her shawl was still hanging by the door, heavy with the scent of wood smoke. On the little table close to the window sat a chipped mug with a hairline crack along the rim. Ruth recognized it at once. Eliza's favorite. It was never used by anyone else, except now it was warm. Out of habit, Ruth reached for the mug the second morning following the funeral with the intention of setting it aside. Faint but distinct, steam curled upward. Someone had poured fresh coffee into it not moments before. She turned to face Caleb. He sat at the table sharpening a knife, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not look up. The mug was still there. Yes, it was. Ruth told herself that grief made people cling to routines, that using Eliza cup was simply a way of holding on. She didn't bring it up. It was considered rude to bring up such topics in Harlem. Similar moments accumulated over the course of the days. Eliza comb appeared on the windowsill each morning, clean of hair as if recently used. At night, a folded dress was taken off the chest and carefully smoothed back on. The closed bedroom's bed was never used for sleeping, yet the blankets shifted subtly from one day to the next. Ruth stayed out of that room. The door stayed closed. Caleb never forbade her from opening it. He didn't have to. Instead, the child caught her attention. The baby was quiet, sleeping for long stretches. Ruth took care of the fireplace, fed him, cleaned his clothes, and held him close to her chest. She felt anchored, helpful, and essential during those times. From a distance, Caleb watched. He hardly ever spoke unless someone spoke to him. When he did, he spoke clearly. He made minor corrections without raising his voice. The cradle positioned A. a few inches too near the flames. The fabric was folded incorrectly. The infant was wrapped too tightly. Each correction was mild and sensible, but when combined, they created a pattern that Ruth was unable to ignore. Ruth rocked the child and hummed a tune one evening as the light faded beyond the trees. It wasn't deliberate. The melody surfaced on its own, familiar and steady. Caleb froze where he stood. He turned slowly, staring at Ruth. His expression changed for a second. Something passed across his face that Ruth could not. Name. Maybe relief or acknowledgement. Eliza used to hum that song. Caleb remained silent. He only nodded once, then returned to his work. But after that night, Ruth caught him watching more closely whenever she sang or spoke softly to the child. She started to feel like she was being evaluated against an unseen standard. At night, Ruth lay awake listening to the sounds of the cabin, the wind moving through the trees, the settling of wood as the fire died, footsteps crossing the floor long after Caleb should have been. Asleep. Once she heard the bedroom door open, she held her breath, waiting for him to return to his own bed. Instead, she heard the faintest sound of fabric shifting, a drawer opening, closing, then silence. In the morning, Eliza's shawl was folded differently on its nail. Ruth did not confront him. The mountains taught people to persevere, to watch, and to know when it was safer to remain silent than to speak the truth. Even so, discomfort began to seep in. She saw that Caleb started preparing meals the way Eliza used to, with thickly sliced cornbread and seasoned beans. Lightly, never salted, until the end. Ruth continued to cook as usual, but Caleb made unexplained adjustments to every dish without offering criticism or corrections. He began referring to small details of Eliza's habits in the present tense. She likes the kettle kept here. At night, she likes the fire to be low. As if no time had passed, the words came out effortlessly. Ruth remained silent while listening. By late autumn, the air was sharper. The forest surrounding the cabin was bare, and the leaves had thinned. Ruth told herself she would leave once winter set in, once Caleb regained his footing. However, every day she stayed made leaving more difficult. She no longer felt as though she had entered the house. It felt like something closing around her. One afternoon, while gathering kindling near the edge of the trees, Ruth found a scarf tangled in the undergrowth. Eliza's scarf, the one she wore on cold mornings. It was clean, recently laundered. Ruth listened to the forest while standing motionless for a considerable amount of time. No birds, no wind. She returned the scarf to the house and placed it where. It was always the case. Caleb remained silent. However, he gave her a look that night that made her skin tingle, as though she had passed a test she was unaware she was taking. Ruth realized something she hadn't yet acknowledged to herself by the time the first frost appeared. Eliza was still in this house. Not in the manner that death was meant to operate, and Ruth was no longer positive that she had come here only to assist. By the time winter loosened its grip on the lower slopes of Harland County, the decision had already been made, not spoken aloud at first, not written down. It existed in the way Caleb began preparing for something that had not yet been named. Even before he spoke, Ruth could sense it. He fixed a board that had been loose for years on the front steps. He cleaned the hearthstones of soot. He moved Eliza boots from beneath the bed and set them carefully into a wooden crate, which he carried into the storage room without explanation. These were not the actions of a man still suspended in grief. They were deliberate, forward-looking. The subjects surfaced one evening as they sat across from each other at the table. The child slept nearby, wrapped in a quilt Ruth had stitched herself. Caleb didn't introduce himself. He said that people in town would talk less if things were made proper. He claimed that the child required a mother who was a member of the household. He claimed that women alone were not treated well by the mountains. Ruth listened. She refrained from interjecting. She saw that he didn't use Eliza's name. She took her time responding. She declared that she had no plans to, remaining indefinitely. She said she had a life beyond this cabin. The words sounded thin even to her own ears. Caleb refrained from arguing. He just nodded, as though her answer had already been taken into consideration. He went into town the next week to file documents. Ruth did not go with him. It wasn't until he came back that she found out. Muddy boots and a quiet, determined expression. The marriage certificate was submitted to the Harlem County Clerk Office in the early spring of 1894. Ruth Rowan and Caleb Rowan are two names that are written clearly. No ceremony took place. Within the mountains, witnesses were not always necessary for marriages. The paper itself was enough to change how people spoke, how doors closed, how eyes followed a woman when she walked through town. Though no one told Ruth directly, word quickly got out. Instead, she became aware of the change in subtle ways. The woman who once left bread on the Rowan porch stopped coming. At the trading post, conversations fell silent when she entered. She was not addressed by name by the minister. Once the documents were signed, the house felt heavier. Ruth moved from the side room into the main bedroom, but Eliza's blankets had already been removed from the bed. The room felt unfamiliar, despite having belonged to her sister, or perhaps because of it. Caleb treated her with formality. He spoke to her as one would speak to a duty that had been accepted rather than desired. However, he was now aware of an undercurrent, a heightened awareness. When they passed people on the street in public, Caleb took a half step ahead of them. Ruth felt the stares. Without getting to know them, people in Harlem did not yell their disapproval. They labeled it and put it away. The pew next to Ruth was empty during their first church service together. Others selected different rows. That day, the minister talked about God-given roles, boundaries, and order. He did not look in their direction. Ruth's gaze remained fixed on the worn floorboards. She felt as though the building itself were pressing down on her. Afterward, no one lingered to speak. She was followed back up by silence, the mountain, hanging on like mist. At home, Caleb resumed old routines. Meals were timed precisely. The child was settled at the same hour each night. Ruth had to learn to live up to expectations that she had never accepted. Caleb started saying things that made her uneasy. Once more, he described the house as complete. He talked about things going back to where they belong. He once moved a plate while setting the table and remarked softly that Eliza had always liked it that way. Ruth froze. She awaited his. Realize what he had said. He didn't. That night, Ruth lay awake listening to the wind move through the bare trees. She wondered when the life she remembered had begun to fade at the edges and when her name had started to feel borrowed. She was still unable to fully comprehend the nature of what was taking place. However, she was aware of this. The marriage had not ended her isolation. It was sealed. Marriage altered the house in ways Ruth had not anticipated. Nothing visible changed at first. The walls remained bare. As usual, the hearth smoked. The distance between objects shrank, but the mountain remained close on all sides. The air itself appeared to be controlled. Caleb started shutting the cabin off from the outside world. Ruth was not prevented from leaving by him. He didn't have to. Without her asking, supplies showed up. Without saying anything, he brought dried meat, flour, and salt from town and placed them on the table. She had no reason to travel the lengthy path by herself. No reason to linger among people who no longer spoke her name. Silently, the loneliness settled like snow that falls in the absence of wind. Order became crucial inside the house. Caleb set up procedures that were unbreakable. There were set times for meal preparation. At night, the fire was banked low and stirred just once before dawn. Windows were opened and closed in accordance with his unwritten timetable. When Ruth asked about these habits, he answered simply that this was how the house worked best. She tried to remind herself that mountain life demanded discipline, that survival depended on predictability. However, the feeling that she was moving through someone else memory grew stronger. One night, Caleb pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle and set it on the bed. He did not take a seat next to her. His hands were clasped behind his back as he stood at the foot. The nights were getting colder, he said. The bundle had been kept secure, he said. He claimed that not making use of what was already available would be wasteful. Ruth slowly unfolded the cloth. One of Eliza's dresses was inside. The fabric was faded but intact, cleaned and mended with care. Ruth recognized the pattern right away. Years before, she had assisted with the hem's sewing. Caleb observed her expression with expectation rather than anticipation. She claimed to have her own wardrobe. She said the dress would not fit her properly. The words came out measured, controlled. Caleb replied that the sisters had always worn the same size. He stated it as a fact rather than an argument. Ruth did not put the dress on that night. Caleb accepted this without protest. He folded it again and returned it to the chest, but the gesture lingered. In the days that followed, Caleb made more frequent corrections to Ruth's chair placement, linen folding, and task order. Every correction was accompanied by a composed explanation that frequently mentioned the previous state of affairs. Ruth noticed that Caleb never raised his voice. He did not threaten. He, Clear's throat, did not command. Rather, he retreated. Silence replaced warmth. Conversation was replaced by distance. When Ruth adjusted her behavior, the house eased. Caleb started talking again. Meals passed, without tension. The beat came back. She began to understand the terms without them ever being stated. Caleb slept lightly at night. Ruth could tell by the way his breathing shifted whenever she moved. Even in the dark, she felt as though someone was keeping an eye on her, recording and remembering any deviation. The bedroom door remained open now. Eliza's presence was no longer limited to recollections. Her things surfaced gradually. There was a hairpin on the dresser, a pair of gloves laid beside Ruth's coat. The lines became hazy. One evening, Ruth reached for her own shawl before stepping outside. Caleb stopped her with a gentle hand on her wrist. Instead, he gestured to Eliza's shawl, who was hanging near the door. He said it was warmer. Ruth took it after just a brief moment of hesitation. The wool carried a familiar weight, the scent of smoke and soap. Ruth experienced something that was almost consoling for a moment. Then the realization followed. The shawl had been waiting and prepared. That night, Ruth dreamed she was standing at the edge of the mountain, looking down into the valley. When? Her voice did not sound like her own when she spoke. She woke before dawn with the certainty that something essential had shifted. The house was more than just a place to store memories of Eliza. It was practicing her comeback. Ruth did not understand at first that the dress had never been a suggestion. It had been a test to see how far she could bend before breaking. On a night when the wind pushed smoke back down the chimney and the air became acrid, the request came back. Caleb had returned from the woods late, with a small deer slung over his shoulder. With steady hands and practiced movements, he cleaned it silently. Ruth cooked what was needed, fed the child, and tried to keep the house warm. There was a tense calm as the evening went by. After the baby was settled, Caleb washed his hands and walked into the bedroom without speaking. Ruth figured he was just exhausted. She spent a little more time by the fireplace, sewing the child blanket's seam. The lamplight was low when she walked into the bedroom. They had turned down the bed. On top of the blanket, the identical bundle of cloth was unfolded, revealing the dress as though it had already been selected. Caleb stood beside it. He glanced from Ruth to the dress and back to Ruth. "The town will see them soon enough," he said. He said that people would not remain apart indefinitely because spring was approaching. He said it was better to appear settled than strange. He said she should wear it. He was asked why by Ruth. In response, Caleb said it was part of the house. He said it fit. It was stupid, he said, to act as though something had changed when it was obvious that nothing had. Ruth felt the room tighten around her. She claimed not to be Eliza. She declared that she wouldn't dress like a ghost in order to appease anyone. She claimed to have already contributed more than she could list. Caleb did not react as she expected. He did not argue. He didn't yell. All he did was move closer, unyielding in a way that chilled her more than anger would have, but not intimidating or coercive. Silently, he repeated the command. He instructed me to put it on. Once more, Ruth declined. Caleb gave one nod, as though taking note of something. Then he turned away and lay down on the bed, fully clothed. He blew out the lamp without another word. For a long time, Ruth stood in the dark, listening to the wind against the walls of the cabin. She didn't get any sleep. Caleb got up early the following morning and left without eating. He did not say where he was going. When he returned around noon, Ruth thought he was hunting or checking traps, but he had nothing. No wood, no game. He had nothing in his hands. He didn't look at her. The silence that ensued was not a grieving silence. It was the silence of the punishment. He went about the house as though she didn't exist. He didn't respond when she spoke. He ate without looking at her when she put food on the table. When she asked about supplies, he walked away. For 2 days, Ruth made an effort to resist. She told herself she could endure coldness. The house felt different when Caleb left, even though she had experienced worse in life. It appeared as though the fire was burning lower. The walls appeared to be closer. Even the child sensed the tension and fussed more, crying in the night for longer stretches. Ruth discovered the dress dangling from a nail next to the bedroom door on the 3rd night. It had not been there before. It was prominently displayed, as though the house itself demanded it. Sharpening his knife once more, Caleb sat at the table. The same steady rhythm and slow strokes. He did not look up. Ruth gazed at the dress as she stood in the doorway. She felt anger rise, then fear, then a distinct form of fatigue. In town, she had no allies. Nobody would support her. There was a marriage record. The child was here. Leaving would mean walking down the mountain carrying an infant, returning to a community that already treated her like a stain. She went to the nail and removed the dress. In the bedroom, she undressed slowly, hands trembling. The fabric warmed up against her skin after initially feeling cold. It fit, just as Caleb had predicted. Caleb finally looked up when she went outside. His expression changed in a way Ruth had not seen before. Not joy, not relief, something closer to completion. He stood, approached her, and adjusted the collar with careful fingers. He smoothed a fold at her shoulder. He stepped back, studying her as if checking the accuracy of a reconstruction. Ruth's stomach churned. Caleb uttered one word so softly that she nearly believed it to be a dream. Eliza. Ruth did not respond. Caleb turned away and went back to his seat after blinking as though he realized he had said something out loud. The time passed. The evening continued. Dinner was served by Ruth. Caleb consumed food. The youngster was asleep. However, Ruth realized at that moment that the dress had altered the house rules. This was no longer about keeping warm or avoiding gossip. It was about transforming her into someone she could never be and making her accept it one small surrender at a time. Ruth lay next to Caleb that night and gazed at the ceiling. The fabric felt like an unwelcome second skin against her body. She heard Caleb in the shadows. The sound of a man settling into comfort is heard as his breathing gets deeper. She wondered if he was dreaming of Eliza, and she wondered what would happen when he woke and saw Ruth again. After the night Ruth wore the dress, Caleb's behavior shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. He remained silent about what had transpired. The name he had said in the darkness was not mentioned. Instead, he acted as though a decision long delayed had finally been confirmed. The days that followed were organized with a new level of accuracy. Caleb began, correcting Ruth's actions as well as her methods. When she tied her hair back to keep it from the fire, he stopped her and showed her a different way, guiding her hands without asking. In order to prevent it from pulling up the scalp, he claimed Eliza always braided it loosely. He claimed that headaches were brought on by tight knots. Ruth did as he showed her. Compared to arguing, it was simpler. Caleb made a remark about how she held her spoon at the table. He angled her wrist by moving it a little. He clarified that Eliza had consumed. Even in times of food scarcity, proceed cautiously and slowly, never hurrying. He said it was better for digestion. Ruth paid attention. She made adjustments. Each correction was framed as care. When she spoke, Caleb sometimes asked her to repeat herself. He identified words that she pronounced differently than Eliza, such as those with a different rhythm or a sharper edge. He gave an example of the cadence he remembered and the phrasing he liked. Ruth practiced without realizing she was practicing. The child became part of the instruction as well. Caleb insisted Ruth. Instead of sitting, rock him while standing. He said Eliza believed movement kept babies calm. When Ruth tried to sing new songs, Caleb stopped her and asked for the old ones, the ones Eliza used to hum. Ruth complied. She initially told herself that these changes were only temporary and that she was making fun of a man who was grieving, but the list of expectations grew longer and the margin for deviation shrank. Caleb pulled out a little pile of twine-tied papers one afternoon. He placed them on the table between them. These were old letters, some of which had faded almost completely. Ruth instantly recognized Eliza's handwriting. Caleb claimed that Eliza had written a lot before getting married, including notes to cousins, lists, and hand-copied scripture, with the same meticulous curves and a slight slant to the right. He advised Ruth to become acquainted with the writing in case she ever needed to sign or leave a note in Eliza's stead. She wasn't comfortable with the wording, but she didn't question it. Ruth used her finger to trace the letters. The action felt intrusive, as though she were trespassing inside something intimate and sealed. Caleb watched closely, his eyes tracking the movement of her hand. He requested that she give it a shot. Ruth hesitated, then picked up the pencil. Her first attempts were clumsy. The lines came out too straight, too firm. Caleb adjusted her hold. He told her to loosen her fingers, to let the pencil move rather than forcing it. They spent hours that afternoon in silence, broken only by the scratch of graphite. Ruth's hand clenched. Her wrist ached, but Caleb did not stop, until the letters began to resemble the originals. When she finally set the pencil down, Caleb nodded once. Ruth had a dream that night about writing her own name and seeing it change into another. As summer progressed, Ruth noticed that she could predict Caleb's responses before they happened. She made proactive behavioral adjustments. She picked words that she knew he liked. She chose clothing that wouldn't attract attention. She started wearing the dress every day. At first, only inside the house, then when Caleb deemed it appropriate on. Walks just beyond the treen, Ruth felt the fabric against her skin constantly now, a reminder of the role she was learning to inhabit. Ruth found a Bible hidden under the bed while cleaning the bedroom one evening. Its leather was darkened and cracked with age, making it older than the others in the house. Inside, several passages were marked. There was one verse in particular that had been heavily underlined. The ink penetrated the page deeply. The handwriting was familiar to Ruth. Eliza was the one. She sat on the floor and read the verse again and again. It discussed limits, forbidden relationships, and afterlife repercussions. Ruth was unsure if Eliza had marked it out of caution, fear, or uncertainty. All she knew was that Caleb had to have seen it previously. Ruth had a dream that night in which she was standing in the cabin doorway and someone else was wearing her face as they moved through the house. She attempted to speak, but nothing came out. She woke with the sensation that her own thoughts were no longer entirely private. The lessons continued each day added another small adjustment, another capitulation presented as a necessity. Ruth felt herself being shaped not through force, but through repetition. She started to question whether the person she was turning into would be able to stop. In early autumn, when the air had started to cool, and the leaves at the forest's edges were beginning to change, Ruth went back to the church on the hill. She had never entered the building since the marriage was officially recorded. With its wooden frame worn from years of use, the church stood apart from the town, wind and rain. The narrow road that wound through the valley below was visible from its steps. When Ruth was a girl, she recalled going to services there and sitting next to Eliza, their heads bowed in prayer, their shoulders almost touching. This time she walked alone. Caleb accompanied her, but did not sit beside her. He chose a pew closer to the front, leaving a measured distance between them. Ruth took a seat near the back, hands folded tightly in her lap. As people entered, she noticed the way they adjusted their paths. Some paused, then chose a different bench. Others offered a brief nod without meeting her eyes. No one spoke her name. The service began without ceremony. The minister read from Scripture in a steady voice. Ruth tried to follow the words, but her attention drifted to the empty spaces around her. She felt as though the air itself were pulling away. When the sermon began, the tone shifted. The minister spoke of order, of boundaries set by God, of the dangers of confusing what had been clearly separated. He spoke of those who attempted to borrow what did not belong to them, and of the harm that followed when lines were crossed. He never looked directly at Ruth. He did not need to. The words pressed down on her heavy and inescapable. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the sense that she was being measured against a standard she could never meet. Caleb sat still throughout the sermon. His posture did not change. If the message troubled him, he gave no sign. When the service ended, the congregation rose quickly. People filed out without lingering. Conversations that usually filled the space after worship were absent. Ruth stood slowly, waiting for someone to acknowledge her presence. No one did. She stepped outside into the pale sunlight and felt the chill settle into her bones. The mountain wind carried the smell of pine and damp earth. It felt sharper than she remembered. As she began the walk back down the hill, Ruth noticed a folded scrap of paper tucked beneath the strap of her bag. She stopped and removed it, her fingers unsteady. The paper contained only a few words written in an uneven hand. "You are not the one who was buried." Ruth read the sentence again and again. There was no signature, no mark to indicate who had left it. The meaning was unmistakable. She crumpled the paper and slipped it into her pocket. She did not show it to Caleb. The walk home felt longer than usual. The trees seemed closer, their branches reaching across the path. Ruth kept her eyes forward, listening for footsteps behind her, though she knew no one followed. At the cabin, Caleb removed his coat and hung it by the door. He asked Ruth nothing about the service. He spoke instead of the weather, of the coming cold, of preparations that needed to be made. Ruth answered when required. Her thoughts remained fixed on the words written on the scrap of paper. That night, she lay awake long after Caleb had fallen asleep. She replayed the sermon in her mind, the phrasing, the emphasis. She wondered whether the minister had spoken from conviction or from pressure. In Harlem, faith and fear often walked together. Ruth touched the dress she wore to bed, the fabric familiar now in a way that frightened her. She tried to recall the last time she had chosen her clothing without considering how it would be received. She tried to remember herself before the mountain had closed in. Sleep came only in fragments. In one dream, Ruth stood at the church altar, while the congregation watched in silence. When she opened her mouth to speak, Eliza's voice emerged instead. She woke before dawn, heart racing, the echo of that voice lingering in her ears. By morning, Ruth understood that the community no longer saw her as a woman who had married unwisely. They saw her as something that should not exist. Winter settled fully into the mountains by the beginning of the new year. Snow clung to the shaded slopes and lingered long after it had melted elsewhere. The Rowan cabin became quieter, sealed in by cold and distance. Supplies were rationed carefully. Firewood stacked high against the wall. Ruth spent more time inside than ever before. It was during one of these long, enclosed days that she climbed into the attic for the first time since her marriage. The access hatch was narrow and stiff with age. Dust fell as she pushed it open, drifting down in pale clouds that caught the light. The attic smelled of old wood and stored time. Trunks and crates were pushed against the slanted walls, their contents untouched for years. Ruth moved slowly, mindful of the brittle boards beneath her feet. She was not searching for anything in particular. The act itself felt forbidden, as though she were crossing into a space that had been intentionally left undisturbed. Still, something drew her forward. Near the far wall, beneath a stack of folded quilts, Ruth found a small wooden box. It was unmarked, its lid loose. Inside lay several folded papers tied with a length of faded ribbon. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Eliza. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the first page. The paper was thin, the ink uneven, in places where the pen had pressed too hard. The words were careful, deliberate, written by someone who expected to be interrupted. The entries were not dated. They read like fragments rather than a continuous record. Observations, doubts, questions left unanswered. Eliza wrote of the house and of Caleb moods. She described his silences, the way his attention lingered. During visits, she noticed times when he observed Ruth and followed the two sisters as if comparing them. Ruth was drawn to one passage. Inhale. Eliza wrote that there were moments when she thought Caleb was looking through her rather than past her, as if he were gauging the gap between what was there and what might take its place. The boards creaked under Ruth's weight as she sat heavily on the attic floor. She continued to read. Eliza had started to be afraid of looking like herself. She wondered whether the similarity between the sisters had become something dangerous. She wondered if love could suddenly become possession. There were no charges, no statements, only discomfort. Ruth read the words slowly, absorbing each one. The attic felt colder with every page. The house below had grown quiet, she realized. Eliza mentioned the child she hoped to have someday in the last note. She wrote that she feared what might happen if she were no longer there to hold her place. The sentence came to an abrupt, incomplete end. Ruth folded the papers back into the box with care. She did not know how long she had been sitting there. Her legs felt weak as she descended. She hid the box beneath a loose, floorboard in the adjacent space. The decision came without thought, instinctive, protective. Caleb saw her distraction that night. What had she been doing, he asked. Ruth answered truthfully, but incompletely. She claimed to have been doing some cleaning. He accepted this without comment, but his eyes lingered on her longer than usual. Ruth went back to the papers by herself later that evening. She read them again by lamplight, her shadow flickering against the wall. The meaning became clearer with each reading. Eliza was aware. Not everything, not the full shape of what would come, but enough to be afraid. Ruth felt a tightening in her chest that did not ease. Slowly, heavily, and irreversibly, the realization set in. It was no coincidence that she had entered this life. She had been noticed. Caleb must have approached the door at some point. Even before she heard him, Ruth could feel his presence. She closed the box quickly, her movements precise. He asked what she was reading. Ruth assured him it was insignificant. Lists and old scraps. Caleb studied her face, searching for something she could not identify. After a moment, he nodded and turned away. Ruth lit the stove after his footsteps had subsided. She picked up one of the pages, not the most, but not the least, and held it above the flame. The paper turned black and curled. The ink vanished. She watched until ash was all that was left. She was unsure if she was erasing a warning or defending herself. That night, Ruth dreamed of Eliza standing at the edge of the forest trying to speak. Every time she opened, her mouth, smoke poured out instead. Ruth was certain that she could no longer escape the past when she woke up before dawn. What followed was already being shaped by it. The meeting was held in the dead of winter, when household visits were uncommon, and the roads through the mountains were hardly passable. It was a customary gathering, a shared meal intended to celebrate surviving the coldest weeks rather than a celebration in the traditional sense. Caleb made the decision to go. Ruth did not argue. At that point, she realized that resistance would only postpone the inevitable. She was meticulous in her preparation, picking outfits that would go unnoticed. Caleb stopped her as she reached for her own coat. Instead, he took another from the chest and gave it to her. It had belonged to Eliza. The coat was heavier than Ruth remembered, the lining worn smooth from years of use. When she put it on, a figure that seemed eerily familiar appeared in the mirror. She was no longer shocked by the similarity. That frightened her more than anything else. They walked down the mountain path together, the snow packed hard beneath their boots. With their branches reaching overhead like interlocked fingers, the trees stood naked. The gathering was held at a large house in the valley, one of the few homes built to host many at once. The yard was covered in long shadows as light poured in through the windows. Voices carried faintly through the cold air. When Ruth entered, the room shifted. Conversation slowed. Several heads turned. Then, equally swiftly, eyes moved away. Ruth felt the weight of attention settle on her, heavy and unspoken. She recognized the looks, not curiosity, recognition. Caleb nodded briefly to a couple of the men. With her hands folded and her posture under control, Ruth stood next to him. She spoke only when addressed, and then only briefly. As the evening wore on, the tension eased slightly. They filled the plates. They passed cups. As the drink flowed, cautious laughter began to emerge in the pockets. Ruth felt herself receding, watching from a distance as if the room were taking her away from herself. A man she didn't know well once came up to her. His steps were unsteady. His cheeks turned red. From alcohol. He looked at Ruth with unfocused eyes, then smiled. He tilted his head, studying her face. "Funny thing," he remarked. "You look exactly like her." The room seemed to pause. Ruth did not answer. Caleb did not step in. The man swayed and laughed softly. He made a hazy gesture toward the mountains. "So tell me," he said, "which one of you is down there in the—" Ruth waited for Caleb to say something, to deny it, to draw a line, but he did not. Instead, his gaze drifted past her, fixing on a spot above the mantel where a small framed photograph of Eliza hung, her expression composed, almost distant. Ruth followed his eyes, and for a moment she felt as though she were watching herself from outside her body. The words landed with a dull finality. No one spoke. The fire crackled. Someone cleared a throat. Ruth felt heat rise in her face. Ruth excused herself and went outside into the cold, the night air burning her lungs, leaning against the wall, breathing deeply, grounding herself in the physical world. Snow crunching beneath her boots, the mountains looming dark and indifferent. Caleb joining her after a while, asking if she was ready to leave. Ruth nodded, and they walked home in silence, the path feeling longer than. Back in the cabin, Ruth took off the coat and hung it by the door, staring at it for a long moment before turning away. That night, as she lay in bed, she whispered her own name under her breath. The sound felt strange. Later, half asleep, she heard herself speak again. This time she said Eliza, not sure which name scared her more. The child was the last thing Ruth believed. Could still bind her to herself. He was small, reliant, unaffected by the silent calculations that controlled the adults around him. Taking care of him gave her a purpose that felt genuine, unabashed. At first, the change happened gradually. The child had started to form words, simple sounds repeated with increasing confidence. Ruth listened carefully, correcting him gently, and grinning when he reached for her. She told herself that this bond remained untouched, whatever else was happening. Then one morning, as she lifted him from the cradle, he turned to face her and said, "Mama Eliza." The sound hit her with an unanticipated force, causing Ruth to freeze as the child balanced against her shoulder. She waited for him to laugh or stumble into another sound to correct himself, but he didn't, so she said her own name out loud and gradually encouraged him to repeat it. The child scowled, perplexed, then shook his head and pressed his face against her collar. Caleb watched from across the room. Ruth tried again later that day and the following. Returning to the same word, Eliza, the syllables came naturally as if practiced. When Ruth finally asked Caleb about it, she told him the child was confused and that it would only get harder to correct over time. Caleb calmly replied that the child had heard the name spoken frequently, that habits had formed early, that it was not harmful, and that he did not agree to assist her in correcting it. Instead, he started using the name himself when addressing the child, being careful to do so when Ruth could hear. Subtle, persistent. Ruth sensed a slow panic starting to build. She corrected the child whenever she could, lowering her voice, repeating her own name, insisting gently but firmly, but the child responded more readily to Caleb. The confusion grew. One evening, while Ruth was rocking him by the fire, the child reached up and touched her face. He smiled and repeated the name again, more clearly this time. Ruth felt something inside her give way, and without thinking, she started humming. The melody was the same tune she had. Caleb watched from the table, his expression unreadable, and after that night the pattern intensified, with the child responding only to certain songs, certain phrases, and certain gestures, all of which were associated with Eliza. Ruth stopped mid-note and stared down at him, horrified. She had not chosen the song. It had emerged on its own, as natural as breathing. The child quieted almost immediately, his body relaxing against hers. The distinction between imitation and instinct blurred. One afternoon, Caleb sent Ruth to the trading post with a short list of supplies. It was the first time she had gone alone in weeks. At the counter, she silently placed her order, and the shopkeeper wrote it down and asked her name for the ledger. Without hesitation, Ruth replied, "Eliza Rowan," before she could stop herself. The shopkeeper nodded and wrote it down. The transaction continued. No one questioned it. Ruth walked home in a daze, her heart pounding. When she reached the cabin, she stood in the doorway for a long moment, trying to steady herself. She repeated her own name under her breath until it felt anchored again. That night, Ruth lay awake beside Caleb, staring into the darkness. The child slept nearby, breathing softly. She realized then that the name had not been taken from her by force. She had begun to give it away. Bye. The line between habit and command had vanished by the time the following winter drew near. Ruth could no longer recall when she had last made her own wardrobe selections. The dresses in the chest were all Eliza's old ones. The few clothes that had once belonged to Ruth were gone. She did not witness their departure. She only realized one morning that the area where they had been folded was empty. Caleb remained silent. The house had become orderly in an unnatural way. Everything rested where it was expected to be. Nothing shifted without purpose. Ruth moved through the rooms carefully, instinctively avoiding disruption. Her reflection startled her less often. The face in the mirror was familiar, composed. She adjusted her hair without thinking, braiding it loosely the way Caleb preferred. The motions felt automatic. At times, she caught herself speaking aloud when no one else was present, not in full sentences, fragments, instructions, reassurances. Sometimes the words sounded like her. Own. Sometimes they didn't. She didn't question it. Caleb's presence had grown heavier, though he spoke less. He no longer corrected Ruth as frequently. There was little need. She anticipated what was needed. The child responded to her easily now, calm and trusting. When he called her Eliza, she didn't correct him. The effort felt pointless and draining. One evening, as the snow pressed against the windows and the wind howled through the trees, Ruth stood at the hearth, rocking the child. She started talking softly, telling a memory from her own childhood. Halfway through, she realized she was describing something Eliza had once told her. She stopped, her breath catching. Caleb looked up from where he sat. He asked her to continue. Ruth hesitated. Then she spoke again, the words flowing easily, filling the space. She could not remember when the memory had become shared. Later that night, after the child was asleep, Caleb closed the door and turned to her. He told her that the house had found its balance again. He said things were finally as they should be. He said she had learned her place. The phrasing struck Ruth with quiet finality. Caleb stepped closer. His voice remained even. He said that Eliza had always belonged there. He said that now at last she was worthy of the position she occupied. Ruth felt a strange calm settle over her. The words should have frightened her. Instead, they felt like an explanation for something she had already accepted. She nodded. That night, she dreamed of standing in front of the mirror while someone else stood behind her. Caleb Rowan died in the middle of winter, when the roads into Harlan County were almost impassable and the mountains were locked in ice. The death was sudden. There was no long illness, no warning that allowed the household to prepare. By morning, Ruth could no longer tell with certainty where one ended and the other began. The house was quiet, the child slept, Caleb prepared for the day. Nothing felt unresolved. One morning, Ruth found him. The fire had burned low, the house was silent, and Caleb was sitting at the table with his head bowed, slightly forward, and his hands flat on the wood as if he had just paused in thought. She called his name once, but he did not answer, and by the time neighbors were alerted and made the slow climb to the cabin, the conclusion had already been reached. The local record would later list the cause as a seizure or stroke, a common explanation in a place where medicine rarely ventured far into the hills. Caleb was buried 2 days later. Later, on the same slope where Eliza had been buried years earlier, the ground was hard and the work was slow. Ruth did not cry. She stood apart from the others, her face composed, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Some later said she looked peaceful. After the burial, people expected Ruth to come down from the mountain because it was an unwritten rule that a widow with a child could not remain alone in such isolation. Assistance was offered cautiously and without warmth. Ruth thanked them and said she would make a decision soon. Seen walking back toward the cabin as the others turned away, their breath rising in pale clouds behind them. No one saw her again. 2 days went by, then 3. When neighbors came back to see how she was doing, the cabin stood silent and closed. The door was barred from the inside. When it was eventually forced open, the interior seemed unaltered. The fire had been extinguished. The table had been cleared. The child cradle stood empty. Ruth's belongings were gone, but only what was required: a heavy shawl, a pair of gloves, a small amount of. The child was never found. Some thought Ruth had taken him down the mountain under cover of darkness, slipping into another county where no one knew her face well enough to question her name. Others whispered that the mountains themselves had claimed her, that the paths she walked. Eliza's clothes were still there. The bed was made. The dress Ruth had worn most frequently lay folded neatly on top, as if set aside with care. There were no signs of struggle. No note. Were not intended for anyone to return from. A few weeks later, while going through Caleb's papers for the county record, a small notebook was found behind a loose board in the storage room. It contained brief entries written in a steady hand that spoke of loss, longing, and a love that could only be restored rather than replaced. One line near the end stood out from the rest. I did not love her because she was Ruth. I loved her because she could become Eliza. The notebook was not recorded in any official ledger, went through a few hands, and then vanished. In Harlan County, the story faded over time. Ruth's name was spoken less frequently. The cabin was abandoned, and the forest reclaimed the path with each passing year. Today, there is no marker bearing Ruth Rowan's name. Just 2 graves on a mountain slope, and a space between them where the soil has never completely settled. In places like these, people are erased gradually until memory itself can no longer recall them, tell who belonged there and who was only ever meant to take someone else's.